Tonight we trace the lives of extraordinary medieval women whose stories unfold like dark fairy tales in castle corridors lit by flickering torches. Queens, duchesses and empresses whose family trees looped so tightly they almost strangled themselves, whose bloodlines became both their crowns and their curses. If you enjoy drifting through these haunting tales of power and consequence, consider joining us for more journeys into history's forgotten chambers. Picture yourself walking through stone halls where tapestries whisper secrets of dynasties that married within their own circles for centuries. The air smells of beeswax candles and dried roses, of incense and the weight of ancient decisions. Here lived women whose destinies were written in blood and sealed with rings that bound cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, creating a web so intricate that love became secondary to lineage. The world of medieval European aristocracy operated on principles that would seem alien today. Marriage was never about affection or compatibility. It was about consolidating power, preserving bloodlines, and ensuring that no castle, no crown, no claim to legitimacy would slip into foreign hands. The logic was crystalline in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. If you marry your cousin, you lose no territory. If you marry a stranger, your heir might be raised in a rival kingdom. So the great houses of Europe, the Habsburgs, the Capetians, the Trastamaras, turned inward, creating genetic whirlpools that would birth some of history's most fascinating and tragic figures. These women were not mere pawns in a masculine Game of Thrones. They were the living bridges between empires, carrying within their bodies the genetic legacy of centuries. Some were brilliant rulers who governed vast territories with wisdom that exceeded their male contemporaries. Others were victims of circumstances beyond their control, trapped in marriages that demanded they produce heirs from bloodlines already stretched thin by repetition. All of them lived under the crushing weight of dynastic expectation, where their success or failure could determine the fate of nations. In the shadowed halls of Spanish palaces, Austrian castles and French chateaux, you will meet women whose names echo through history like whispered prayers. Isabella of Habsburg, married at 13 to save a dying dynasty. Joanna of Castile, whose alleged madness may have been nothing more than grief weaponized by power-hungry men. Maria Theresa of Austria, who bore 16 children to secure her empire's future. Each carried within her veins the accumulated heritage of generations who had married not for love, but for the preservation of royal blood. The term inbreeding carries different weight in our modern understanding, but for these medieval nobles, it represented strategy rather than taboo. The great dynasties did not intermarry for amusement or convenience. They did it to hoard power, to maintain legitimacy, to ensure that every drop of royal blood remained within carefully guarded circles. Yet over generations, this careful preservation led to consequences that no amount of political calculation could have predicted. Modern geneticists have studied these royal lineages with fascination and horror. They have calculated inbreeding coefficients, traced recessive traits, and mapped the gradual accumulation of genetic disorders that plagued Europe's most powerful families. What they discovered reads like a medical textbook written in blood and tears. Elongated jaws that made eating difficult, fertility problems that claimed countless potential heirs, recurring mental illness that blurred the line between political instability and genuine psychological suffering. The Habsburg jaw became the most visible symbol of this genetic narrowing, a mandibular prognathism so pronounced that it affected speech, eating and breathing. But it was merely the external manifestation of deeper problems. Behind palace walls, royal women endured miscarriage after miscarriage, stillbirths that broke their hearts and endangered their political positions, children born with conditions that medieval medicine could neither understand nor treat. Yet these women persevered with remarkable strength. They learned multiple languages, governed kingdoms in their husbands' absence, negotiated treaties that shaped the political landscape of Europe. They were mothers, rulers, diplomats and survivors, navigating a world where their genetic heritage was both their greatest asset and their heaviest burden. The stone corridors of their palaces seemed to whisper still with the echoes of their footsteps, their prayers, their whispered conversations in languages that blended the tongues of nations they had united through marriage. Each woman carried within her the hopes of dynasties and the weight of bloodlines that had been carefully preserved across centuries. As we begin this journey through their lives, imagine the rustle of silk gowns against cold stone floors, the flicker of candlelight on portraits, with remarkably similar faces, the weight of crowns that had been passed from mother to daughter in an unbroken chain of royal inheritance. These were women who lived in a world where family meant everything, and meant far too much, where the preservation of bloodline purity came at costs that only became apparent generations later. Their stories unfold like a tapestry woven from threads of gold and shadow, each life connected to the others through bonds stronger than friendship, deeper than love, more binding than law. They were connected by blood, by duty, by the shared burden of carrying forward dynasties that believed their survival depended on never allowing fresh blood to enter their carefully guarded genetic pools. The first light of dawn filters through tall windows as we step into the chambers of Isabella of Habsburg, a woman whose very existence embodied the genetic complexity of her age. Born in 1501 into a world where her bloodline had already folded upon itself like an intricate origami sculpture, Isabella represented both the pinnacle of Habsburg breeding and its inherent dangers. Her parents, Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile, shared grandparents, making Isabella the product of cousins whose own genetic heritage traced back through generations of strategic marriages. From the moment of her birth in Brussels, her value was measured not in personal qualities but in the purity of her bloodline, the concentration of royal characteristics that made her an ideal bride for another European dynasty. The political landscape of early 16th century Europe demanded constant vigilance and strategic alliance building. Isabella's marriage at 13 to Christian II of Denmark represented more than a union between two young people. It was a bridge between the Habsburg Empire and Scandinavian power, a genetic investment in future political stability. Her young body became the vessel through which influence would flow, her womb the crucible where the next generation of European royalty would be forged. Christian II was described by contemporaries with diplomatic delicacy, but the underlying message was clear: he was unstable, unpredictable, and already devoted to a mistress whom he refused to abandon even after his royal marriage. Difik Sigbrits Datter held a position in the Danish court that should have belonged to Isabella, creating a triangle of power that placed impossible pressures on a young woman already burdened by dynastic expectations. The psychological toll of such arrangements can barely be imagined. Isabella found herself in a foreign court, speaking languages she had learned from tutors rather than from childhood immersion, surrounded by customs that differed from her Habsburg upbringing. Her husband divided his attention between political necessities and personal desires, leaving her to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, while bearing children who would represent the future of Danish-Habsburg relations. She bore 6 children during her brief marriage, a remarkable feat considering the medical understanding of the time and the genetic risks inherent in her bloodline. 3 survived infancy, which represented both a personal triumph and a political necessity. Each birth was scrutinized not merely for the health of the child, but for its potential contribution to dynastic stability. Each loss was mourned not only as a personal tragedy but as a political setback. The sudden death of Christian's mistress created unexpected opportunities for Isabella to assert her position at court. Whether through political maneuvering or simple circumstance, she found herself elevated from the status of neglected wife to that of influential queen. Her fluency in multiple languages, her understanding of international politics, and her connection to the vast Habsburg network made her an invaluable asset to the Danish crown. Yet genetic heritage proved stronger than political necessity. Isabella's health, already compromised by the accumulated effects of generations of cousin marriages, began to deteriorate. She experienced symptoms that modern medical understanding might classify as inherited blood disorders, autoimmune conditions, or neurological problems passed down through bloodlines that had been carefully preserved, but not carefully monitored for health consequences. Her death at 24 represented more than the loss of a young queen. It symbolized the fragility of the entire system that had created her. The same genetic purity that made her valuable as a bride also made her vulnerable to conditions that outbred populations might have avoided. Her children carried forward even more concentrated royal blood, ensuring that the next generation of Habsburgs would face even greater genetic risks. The legacy of Isabella of Habsburg extends far beyond her brief life. Her descendants would populate the royal courts of Europe, carrying within their veins the accumulated heritage of centuries of strategic breeding. The concentration of royal characteristics that made her politically valuable also made her biologically vulnerable, a paradox that would haunt her dynasty for generations to come. In the quiet chambers where she spent her final months, Isabella represented both the triumph and the tragedy of medieval royal marriage. She had fulfilled her dynastic duties, producing heirs who would continue the Habsburg line. Yet she had also paid the ultimate price for the genetic policies that had created her, becoming another casualty in the long struggle between political necessity and biological reality. The morning light grows stronger as we follow the threads of inheritance that led from Isabella to her mother, Joanna of Castile, known to history by the haunting epithet, the Mad. Yet as we examine her story more closely, the lines between madness and reasonable response to impossible circumstances begin to blur like watercolors in rain. Joanna entered the world in 1479 as the daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who had unified Spain and funded Columbus's voyages of discovery. Her parents were second cousins, a relationship that seemed almost distant by the standards that would later govern Habsburg marriages. Yet even this seemingly modest degree of relatedness represented the beginning of the genetic concentration that would define her daughter's inheritance. The young Joanna was educated in the manner befitting a Spanish infanta, learning Latin, theology, and the intricate protocols of royal behavior. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent, devout, and possessed of a fierce temper when provoked. She was not the compliant, passive princess that many political marriages required, but rather a woman of strong opinions and deeper emotions than court life typically accommodated. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy was intended to forge a powerful alliance between Spain and the Low Countries. Philip possessed not only political value but also the personal magnetism that his nickname suggested. Unlike many arranged royal marriages, this union began with genuine attraction between the principals, a passion that would prove both blessing and curse for Joanna's future happiness. The early years of their marriage revealed the intensity of Joanna's emotional nature. She loved Philip with a devotion that transcended political calculation, experiencing jealousy when he took mistresses and joy when he showed her attention. In a world where royal marriages were expected to be ceremonial partnerships rather than passionate relationships, Joanna's emotional investment in her husband marked her as different, vulnerable, potentially dangerous to political stability. When her mother Queen Isabella died and Joanna inherited the crown of Castile, she should have become one of the most powerful women in Europe. Instead, she found herself caught between her husband's ambition to rule in her name and her father's determination to maintain control over Spanish politics. Both men found it convenient to question her mental stability, using her passionate nature and emotional responses as evidence of her unfitness to rule. The campaign to declare Joanna incompetent began as political necessity and gradually became accepted historical fact. Her husband Philip and her father Ferdinand both benefited from her marginalization, each claiming to protect Spanish interests while actually pursuing their own advancement. The narrative of her madness provided perfect justification for excluding her from power while maintaining the legal fiction that she remained queen. Philip's sudden death in 1506 triggered the most famous chapter of Joanna's story. Her grief was profound and, by medieval standards, excessive. She refused to allow his burial for years, traveling across Castile with his embalmed body, demanding prayers for his soul at monasteries and churches throughout her kingdom. She opened his coffin periodically to gaze upon his face, refused to allow women near his remains, and created a ritual of mourning that scandalized the court and provided her enemies with perfect evidence of her insanity. Yet modern historians increasingly question the traditional narrative of Joanna's madness. Her behavior, while extreme, can be understood as the response of a grieving widow who had lost not only her beloved husband, but also her political independence and access to her children. The men around her had systematically isolated her, using her emotional responses as weapons against her authority, while simultaneously provoking those same responses through their treatment of her. The genetic component of Joanna's story cannot be ignored. Her parents'-cousin relationship, combined with Philip's own Habsburg connections, created a bloodline that was beginning to show signs of concentration. Some of her children would display the early symptoms of what would later become characteristic Habsburg traits: the elongated jaw, the fertility problems, the tendency toward mental instability that might have been inherited predisposition rather than environmental response. Joanna spent the last 46 years of her life confined in the palace of Tordesillas, officially Queen of Castile but powerless to exercise royal authority. Her children were raised away from her influence, her political opinions were ignored, and her emotional needs were dismissed as symptoms of her alleged madness. She became a living ghost, haunting the corridors of her own palace while her kingdom was governed in her name by men who had declared her unfit to rule. The tragedy of Joanna of Castile extends beyond her personal suffering to encompass the broader implications of her story. She represented the dangers inherent in a system that placed political convenience above human dignity, that used accusations of mental illness to silence inconvenient voices, and that began the Habsburg tradition of sacrificing individual welfare to dynastic necessity. Her genetic legacy would prove as significant as her political marginalization. Through her children, the concentrated bloodline that had created her own vulnerabilities would pass to future generations, carrying with it both the strength of royal heritage and the increasing risks of genetic isolation. The same characteristics that made her politically valuable also made her personally vulnerable, a pattern that would repeat throughout Habsburg history. As the sun climbs higher in the medieval sky, we turn our attention to another chapter in this expanding tapestry of royal genetics and political necessity. Blanche of Castile emerges from the shadows of history as a figure whose life bridged the gap between Spanish Habsburg concentration and French Capetian ambition, carrying genetic material that would influence European royalty for centuries to come. Born in 1188 to Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England, Blanche represented the confluence of two powerful bloodlines already showing signs of internal concentration. Her Spanish heritage connected her to the Trastamara dynasty that would later interweave with Habsburg genetics, while her English ancestry linked her to the Plantagenet line that had its own tradition of strategic intermarriage. The political marriage that brought Blanche to France at age 12 represented more than a simple alliance between kingdoms. She was originally intended as a substitute bride, selected when her sister Urraca was deemed unsuitable for reasons that historical records only hint at darkly. Some sources suggest that Urraca displayed signs of inherited instability, making Blanche the safer genetic choice for continuing the French royal line. Her marriage to the future Louis VIII of France in 1200 created another loop in the increasingly complex web of European royal genetics. Louis and Blanche were third cousins, close enough to require papal dispensation, but distant enough to avoid the most obvious genetic risks. Yet their union represented another step in the gradual concentration of royal bloodlines that would characterize medieval European politics. Blanche's role in French history extended far beyond her function as a royal broodmare. When Louis died in 1226, leaving their 12-year-old son Louis VI as king, Blanche declared herself regent and proceeded to govern France with an authority that few women of her era could have imagined. Her political acumen, linguistic abilities, and understanding of international relations made her one of the most effective rulers of the 13th century. The genetic implications of Blanche's bloodline became apparent in her children's health patterns. She bore 13 children to Louis VIII, but only a few survived to adulthood. The high infant mortality rate was typical for the medieval period, but some historians note that the pattern of early deaths and recurring illnesses in her offspring suggested inherited vulnerabilities that might have stemmed from the gradual concentration of royal genetics. Her son Louis IX, who would later become Saint Louis, survived to rule effectively, but several of his siblings suffered from health problems that contemporary physicians could not adequately explain or treat. The family medical history included recurring episodes of what medieval doctors termed melancholia, symptoms that modern understanding might classify as inherited mood disorders or neurological conditions. Blanche's own health showed signs of the stress that characterized royal women's lives. She suffered from severe headaches, periodic episodes of what court physicians called nervous exhaustion, and physical symptoms that may have represented early signs of autoimmune disorders linked to genetic concentration. Her death in 1252 followed a collapse that witnesses described as sudden and devastating, possibly indicating stroke or other cardiovascular problems. The political legacy of Blanche of Castile included her successful management of French territorial expansion and her effective handling of baronial rebellions that threatened her son's authority. She negotiated treaties, supervised military campaigns, and maintained diplomatic relationships with powers throughout Europe. Her regency demonstrated that royal women could exercise political authority effectively when circumstances permitted. Yet her genetic legacy proved equally significant. Through her children, the bloodlines of Castile and France became permanently intertwined, creating genetic connections that would influence European royalty for generations. The same concentration of royal characteristics that made her children politically valuable also made them medically vulnerable, establishing patterns that would repeat throughout medieval and early modern European history. Blanche's story illustrates the double-edged nature of medieval royal marriage. Her success as a ruler demonstrated the capabilities that royal women possessed when given opportunities to exercise authority. Yet her genetic heritage and the marriages of her descendants contributed to the gradual concentration of bloodlines that would eventually produce the medical catastrophes associated with Habsburg inbreeding. The threads of inheritance weave ever more tightly as we follow the bloodlines eastward to Portugal, where Eleanor of Portugal would find herself caught in perhaps the most genetically concentrated marriage of her era. Her union with Emperor Frederick III represented not merely a political alliance but a biological experiment whose consequences would echo through European history for centuries. Eleanor's birth in 1434 placed her at the center of Portuguese royal politics during a period of territorial expansion and dynastic consolidation. Her father, King Edward of Portugal, and her mother Eleanor of Aragon, represented the convergence of Iberian royal bloodlines that had been intermarrying for generations. The House of Aviz to which she belonged had already begun the process of genetic concentration that would characterize later European royal families. The marriage negotiations that would determine Eleanor's fate involved calculations of unprecedented complexity. The Holy Roman Empire needed a Portuguese alliance to balance French power in southern Europe, while Portugal sought imperial protection for its expanding maritime empire. Eleanor's bloodline offered the genetic credentials necessary to legitimize the union, while her political value ensured imperial acceptance. Frederick III represented his own genetic complications. As the son of Ernest the Iron and Simburgers of Masovia, he carried bloodlines that had been concentrated through generations of strategic marriages within the German nobility. His Habsburg heritage already showed signs of the facial characteristics and health problems that would become more pronounced in later generations. The wedding ceremony in 1452 followed protocols designed to emphasize the political significance of the union, while carefully managing the genetic implications that contemporary science could not fully understand. Eleanor traveled to Italy with a retinue that included physicians, theologians, and genealogists whose job was to ensure that the marriage would produce healthy heirs capable of continuing both bloodlines. The early years of Eleanor and Frederick's marriage revealed the challenges inherent in unions between closely related royal families. Their shared ancestry created genetic risks that medieval medicine could neither predict nor prevent, while their cultural differences created personal tensions that political necessity could not entirely overcome. Eleanor's Portuguese upbringing had prepared her for a court culture that differed significantly from the Germanic formality of Frederick's empire. Their children represented both the success and the failure of medieval genetic policies. Maximilian, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor, inherited sufficient political ability to govern effectively, while also displaying the early signs of Habsburg facial characteristics that would become more pronounced in subsequent generations. The other children showed varying degrees of health problems that may have reflected inherited vulnerabilities. Eleanor's personal struggles with her role as empress reflected the broader challenges facing royal women in genetically concentrated marriages. Her letters, preserved in imperial archives, reveal a woman struggling with homesickness, cultural isolation, and health problems that contemporary physicians attributed to everything from climate change to spiritual disturbance. Modern medical understanding might classify her symptoms as manifestations of autoimmune disorders or mood conditions with genetic components. The political responsibilities that Eleanor assumed as empress required her to navigate the complex relationships between the Holy Roman Empire and the emerging nation-states of Western Europe. She served as regent during Frederick's absences, managed imperial finances, and oversaw diplomatic negotiations with powers throughout the continent. Her political effectiveness demonstrated the capabilities that royal women possessed when circumstances allowed them to exercise authority. Yet the genetic legacy of Eleanor's marriage proved more significant than her political achievements. Through Maximilian, the bloodlines of Portugal and Austria became permanently connected, creating genetic patterns that would influence European royalty for centuries. The concentration of royal characteristics that made their children politically valuable also made them medically vulnerable to conditions that would become increasingly apparent in later generations. Eleanor's death in 1467, at age 32, followed a pattern common among royal women of her era. The official cause was listed as complications from childbirth, but contemporary accounts suggest a more complex medical picture involving recurring illnesses, physical weakness, and psychological distress that may have reflected inherited vulnerabilities exacerbated by the stresses of imperial politics. Her legacy extends beyond her immediate family to encompass the broader patterns of European royal genetics. The marriage that brought Portuguese blood into the Habsburg line represented another step in the gradual concentration of royal bloodlines that would eventually produce the medical catastrophes associated with extreme inbreeding. Eleanor's life illustrates both the political necessities that drove such marriages and the human costs that they exacted from the women who were expected to make them successful. The golden afternoon light filters through tall windows as we encounter Margaret of Austria, a woman whose life exemplified both the political sophistication and the genetic vulnerabilities that characterized Habsburg royalty at the dawn of the modern era. Born into a bloodline already showing signs of concentration, Margaret would navigate the treacherous currents of European politics while carrying within her body the accumulated heritage of generations. Margaret's birth in 1480 marked her as a product of the marriage between Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy, a union that had successfully consolidated Habsburg control over the Low Countries, while also concentrating bloodlines that had been intermarrying for generations. Her genetic heritage included not only Habsburg characteristics but also the Burgundian traits that would influence her descendants' physical appearance and health patterns. The early death of her mother left Margaret motherless at age 2, a loss that would shape both her political education and her understanding of the precarious nature of royal women's lives. Maximilian's decision to betroth her to the French Dauphin Charles at age 3 represented the kind of long-term political calculation that characterized Habsburg diplomacy, treating her as a valuable asset whose deployment required careful timing and strategic patience. Her childhood in the French court provided Margaret with an education in international politics that few royal women of her era could have imagined. She learned not only languages and diplomatic protocols but also the subtle arts of court intrigue, alliance management, and the complex relationships between personal loyalty and political necessity. When Charles abruptly cancelled their engagement to marry Anne of Brittany instead, Margaret experienced her first lesson in the expendability of royal women when political calculations changed. The subsequent marriage to Juan of Castile brought Margaret into direct contact with the Spanish royal bloodlines that would later prove so problematic for Habsburg genetics. Juan represented the convergence of multiple royal lines, including both Habsburg and Trastamara inheritance, making their union another step in the concentration of European royal genetics. Their marriage, though brief due to Juan's early death, demonstrated the health problems that were beginning to affect royalty throughout Europe. Margaret's return to the Habsburg court following Juan's death marked the beginning of her emergence as a political figure in her own right, rather than simply a dynastic pawn to be deployed in marriage negotiations. Her decision never to remarry represented both personal choice and political calculation, allowing her to exercise authority that would have been impossible had she remained subordinate to another husband's political priorities. Her role as governor of the Netherlands twice demonstrated the political capabilities that royal women possessed when circumstances allowed them to exercise authority. Margaret's administration was marked by diplomatic sophistication, fiscal responsibility and cultural patronage that made the Low Countries one of the most prosperous and politically stable regions of Europe during her tenure. Yet the genetic heritage that made Margaret politically valuable also created vulnerabilities that affected both her health and her descendants' welfare. The Habsburg facial characteristics were becoming more pronounced in her generation, while fertility problems and recurring illnesses suggested that the concentration of royal bloodlines was beginning to produce measurable medical consequences. Margaret's correspondence reveals a woman acutely aware of the genetic implications of royal marriage policies. Her letters discussing potential matches for her nieces and nephews demonstrate understanding of the risks involved in continued close intermarriage, yet also recognition of the political necessities that made such unions attractive to Habsburg interests. She arranged marriages that balanced genetic considerations with political requirements, though the balance increasingly favored politics over biology. Her patronage of arts and learning reflected both personal inclination and political strategy. Margaret's court became a center for humanist scholarship, artistic innovation and cultural exchange that influenced European intellectual development for generations. Her support for education and her own extensive correspondence with scholars throughout Europe demonstrated the intellectual capabilities that royal women could exercise when freed from the constant pressures of childbearing and marriage politics. The genetic legacy that Margaret passed to her descendants included both the strengths and the vulnerabilities that characterized Habsburg bloodlines. Her nephew Charles V would inherit not only her political acumen but also the accumulated genetic load of generations of strategic intermarriage. The concentration of royal characteristics that made the Habsburg family politically powerful also made them increasingly vulnerable to the medical problems that would plague later generations. Margaret's death in 1530 marked the end of an era in Habsburg politics. She had successfully managed the transition from medieval to early modern diplomatic practices while maintaining family interests across multiple kingdoms and territories. Yet she had also participated in the genetic concentration that would eventually produce the medical catastrophes associated with extreme Habsburg inbreeding. Her story illustrates the complex relationship between individual capability and systemic constraints that characterized royal women's lives. Margaret demonstrated remarkable political skills and intellectual curiosity, yet she remained bound by genetic heritage and family expectations that limited her choices and influenced her descendants' welfare in ways that contemporary science could not predict or prevent. The warm Spanish sunlight bathes the corridors of the Alcazar as we encounter Catherine of Aragon, a woman whose genetic heritage and political fate would intertwine to create one of the most significant dynastic crises in European history. Her bloodline connected multiple royal houses, while her marriages would demonstrate both the promise and the peril of strategic interbreeding among Europe's ruling families. Catherine's birth in 1485 to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile placed her at the center of Spanish unification and expansion. Her parents were second cousins sharing Trastamara ancestry that had been concentrated through generations of strategic marriages designed to consolidate Iberian political control. Their union had successfully created the most powerful kingdom in contemporary Europe while also beginning the genetic concentration that would characterize later Spanish royal families. The political calculations that determined Catherine's matrimonial fate reflected both the international significance of Spanish power and the genetic implications of royal marriage policies. Her betrothal to Arthur, Prince of Wales, represented Henry VII's determination to ally England with the emerging Spanish superpower, while also bringing Habsburg-related bloodlines into the English royal family for the first time. Catherine's education prepared her for international queenship in ways that distinguished her from many contemporary royal women. She was fluent in Latin, Spanish, French, and English, capable of conducting diplomatic correspondence, and familiar with both theology and statecraft. Her intellectual preparation would prove crucial during the political crises that would later define her reign as Queen of England. The marriage to Arthur in 1501 lasted only 5 months before his death, possibly from tuberculosis or the sweating sickness that periodically devastated English populations. Catherine's widowhood at age 16 created both political problems and genetic opportunities, as her potential remarriage could either strengthen or complicate Anglo-Spanish relations depending upon her new husband's political affiliations. The negotiations for her second marriage to Henry VIII involved unprecedented genetic and political complications. Marrying her deceased husband's brother technically violated canon law regarding consanguinity, requiring papal dispensation based upon Catherine's sworn testimony that her first marriage had never been consummated. The theological arguments that would later be used to annul this second marriage were present from its inception. Catherine's early years as Queen of England demonstrated both her political capabilities and the genetic challenges that would define her reproductive history. She served effectively as regent during Henry's military campaigns in France, overseeing both domestic administration and military preparations that culminated in the English victory at Flodden Field. Her political competence exceeded that of many contemporary male rulers. Yet the genetic heritage that made Catherine politically valuable also created reproductive problems that would ultimately destroy her marriage and transform English religious history. Her pregnancy history included at least 6 documented conceptions, but only one child, Mary Tudor, survived to adulthood. The pattern of miscarriages and infant deaths reflected genetic incompatibilities that contemporary medicine could neither understand nor treat. Modern medical analysis suggests that Catherine may have suffered from Kell sensitization, a condition in which maternal antibodies attack fetal blood cells, causing pregnancy losses after an initial successful birth. This condition can be influenced by genetic factors and may have been exacerbated by the concentration of bloodlines that characterized both Catherine's Spanish heritage and Henry's English royal ancestry. The theological arguments that Henry used to justify annulling their marriage focused on biblical prohibitions against marrying a deceased brother's widow. But the underlying issue was Catherine's failure to produce the male heir that Tudor dynastic security required. Her reproductive problems, possibly caused by genetic factors related to royal intermarriage, became the catalyst for England's break with Rome and the establishment of an independent English church. Catherine's resistance to the annulment proceedings demonstrated both personal courage and political sophistication. She refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of ecclesiastical courts that denied papal authority, insisted upon her status as Henry's lawful wife, and maintained that their daughter Mary was the legitimate heir to the English throne. Her defiance required both legal knowledge and diplomatic skill that few contemporary women possessed. The final years of Catherine's life were spent in relative isolation at Kimbolton Castle, separated from her daughter and denied recognition as queen. Yet she continued to correspond with European monarchs, maintained her claim to legitimacy, and influenced English politics through her supporters at court. Her death in 1536 removed the final obstacle to Henry's religious policies while also eliminating the genetic line that might have produced different outcomes for English royal succession. Catherine's genetic legacy influenced European royalty through her daughter Mary Tudor, whose own reproductive problems may have reflected inherited vulnerabilities passed down through generations of strategic royal intermarriage. The concentration of bloodlines that made Catherine politically valuable also made her reproductively vulnerable, illustrating the biological costs of political policies that prioritized dynastic purity over genetic diversity. Her story demonstrates the complex relationships between individual biography and systemic constraints that characterized royal women's lives. Catherine possessed remarkable political abilities and personal courage, yet she remained subject to genetic heritage and reproductive expectations that ultimately determined both her personal fate and her historical significance. The late afternoon sun slants through the windows of the Portuguese court as we encounter Isabella of Portugal, a woman whose marriage would represent one of the most genetically concentrated unions in European royal history. Her relationship with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, embodied both the political logic and the biological dangers of the Habsburg commitment to preserving bloodline purity through strategic intermarriage. Isabella's birth in 1503 placed her at the intersection of Portuguese expansion and Spanish consolidation. Her father, King Manuel I of Portugal, had pursued marriage policies designed to strengthen Portuguese claims to Spanish territory, while her mother, Maria of Aragon, represented the Trastamara bloodlines that connected Portuguese royalty to Spanish Habsburg interests. Isabella's genetic heritage thus included multiple layers of Iberian royal ancestry, that had been concentrated through generations of cousin marriages. The marriage negotiations between Isabella and Charles V involve calculations of unprecedented genetic complexity. Both potential spouses descended from the same royal ancestors through multiple genealogical paths, making them simultaneously first cousins, second cousins, and more distant relatives, depending upon which ancestral lines were emphasized. Their union would create the most genetically concentrated marriage in Habsburg history up to that point. Charles V's political situation required a bride whose bloodline credentials were unquestionable and whose territories could contribute to imperial expansion. Isabella offered both Portuguese maritime wealth and genetic purity that satisfied Habsburg requirements for dynastic continuity. Her education and personal qualities were secondary considerations to the political and genetic advantages that her marriage would provide. The wedding ceremony in 1526 was celebrated throughout the empire as the union of two compatible bloodlines that would produce heirs capable of governing both Spanish and Portuguese territories. Contemporary observers noted the physical similarities between bride and groom, commenting upon their shared facial characteristics and family resemblances in ways that modern genetics would interpret as evidence of dangerous genetic concentration. Isabella's role as empress required her to manage Spanish domestic politics during Charles's frequent absences for imperial business throughout Europe. She demonstrated administrative competence, diplomatic skill, and cultural sophistication that made her an effective regent and a valued imperial partner. Her correspondence reveals a woman capable of understanding complex political situations and making decisions that balanced competing interests. Yet the genetic heritage that made Isabella politically suitable also created health problems that affected both her personal welfare and her reproductive success. She suffered from recurring illnesses that contemporary physicians attributed to climatic changes, dietary factors, or spiritual disturbances, but which modern medical understanding might classify as autoimmune disorders or other conditions with genetic components. Her pregnancy history illustrated both the promises and the perils of genetically concentrated royal marriages. She bore 7 children to Charles, but only 3 survived to adulthood, including Philip II of Spain, who would inherit both his parents' political abilities and their accumulated genetic vulnerabilities. The high rate of infant mortality may have reflected genetic incompatibilities that increased the risk of birth defects and early death. Isabella's personal relationship with Charles appears to have been unusually affectionate by royal standards. His letters express genuine grief at their separations and appreciation for her political counsel, while her correspondence reveals emotional attachment that transcended mere dynastic duty. Their marriage represented one of the more successful personal relationships in Habsburg history, despite its genetic risks. The administrative responsibilities that Isabella assumed during her regencies demonstrated the political capabilities that royal women could exercise when circumstances permitted. She managed Spanish finances during periods of imperial expansion, oversaw military preparations for campaigns against Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, and maintained diplomatic relationships with powers throughout Europe. Her death in 1539 at age 36 followed complications from her final pregnancy, a pattern that had claimed numerous royal women whose bodies were expected to produce heirs regardless of their physical condition. Charles's grief was profound and lasting. He wore mourning dress for the remainder of his life and never remarried, unusual behavior for a monarch whose dynastic responsibilities normally required multiple marriage alliances. The genetic legacy that Isabella passed to her children included both political capabilities and medical vulnerabilities that would influence European history for generations. Philip II inherited his parents' administrative skills and religious devotion, while also displaying the Habsburg jaw and other physical characteristics that would become more pronounced in subsequent generations. Isabella's story illustrates the complex relationship between personal affection and political necessity that characterized the most successful royal marriages. Her union with Charles V represented both genuine emotional compatibility and strategic genetic concentration, demonstrating how individual happiness and dynastic requirements could sometimes be reconciled even within systems that prioritized political necessity over personal preference. Yet her life also demonstrates the human costs of genetic policies that treated royal women as repositories of bloodline purity rather than individuals whose health and welfare deserved consideration. The same genetic concentration that made her politically valuable also made her medically vulnerable, creating a pattern that would repeat throughout Habsburg history with increasingly devastating consequences. The shadows lengthen as we move northward to the Low Countries, where Marie of Burgundy would find herself at the center of political machinations that would reshape European power structures while continuing the genetic concentration that characterized royal marriage policies. Her brief life would demonstrate both the possibilities and the limitations that confronted royal women during the transition from medieval to early modern political systems. Marie's birth in 1457 made her the sole heir to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest and most strategically important territories in Europe. Her father's determination to create a male heir had been frustrated by circumstance, leaving Marie as his political successor and the most valuable marriage prize in contemporary European diplomacy. Her education prepared her for sovereign authority in ways that few women of her era could have imagined. The sudden death of Charles the Bold in 1477 at the Battle of Nancy created a power vacuum that threatened to destabilize European politics. Marie, at 19, found herself responsible for territories that were coveted by France, desired by the Holy Roman Empire, and essential to English commercial interests. Her marriage choice would determine not only her personal fate, but also the political future of one of Europe's most prosperous regions. The competing marriage proposals that surrounded Marie reflected the international significance of Burgundian inheritance. Louis XI of France demanded that she marry his son, bringing Burgundian territories under French control. The Habsburg proposal offered Maximilian of Austria, representing imperial interests that would maintain Burgundian independence while creating new opportunities for territorial expansion. Marie's eventual choice of Maximilian represented both personal preference and political calculation. Their marriage in 1477 would bring Burgundian wealth into the Habsburg Empire, while also concentrating bloodlines that had been intermarrying for generations. Maximilian's genetic heritage included connections to multiple royal families, making their union another step in the gradual concentration of European royal genetics. The early years of Marie and Maximilian's marriage demonstrated both the personal compatibility and the political challenges that characterized their relationship. Marie retained significant authority over Burgundian administration, while also supporting Maximilian's imperial ambitions. Their partnership represented one of the more successful power-sharing arrangements in contemporary European politics. Yet Marie's genetic heritage created vulnerabilities that affected both her health and her descendants' welfare. The Burgundian bloodlines had been concentrated through generations of strategic marriages within the French and German nobility, creating genetic patterns that would contribute to the Habsburg characteristics that became more pronounced in later generations. Her children with Maximilian carried both the political advantages and the genetic risks associated with their parents' bloodlines. Philip the Handsome would inherit Burgundian territories and Habsburg claims while also displaying the early signs of physical characteristics that would become more pronounced in subsequent generations. Margaret and other children showed varying degrees of health problems that may have reflected inherited vulnerabilities. Marie's death in 1482 at age 25 resulted from injuries sustained in a hunting accident, but her brief life had already established genetic and political patterns that would influence European history for centuries. Her bloodline contributions to the Habsburg family included both strengths and vulnerabilities that would become more apparent as genetic concentration continued through subsequent generations. The political legacy of Marie's marriage included the permanent incorporation of Burgundian territories into the Habsburg Empire, creating the territorial base that would support Spanish and German expansion throughout the early modern period. Her genetic legacy included the introduction of Burgundian bloodlines into Habsburg inheritance patterns, contributing to the concentration of royal characteristics that would eventually produce medical problems. Marie's story illustrates the precarious nature of royal women's lives during periods of political transition. She possessed both political authority and personal agency unusual for women of her era, yet she remained vulnerable to circumstances beyond her control. Her death cut short a political career that might have influenced European development in ways that can only be imagined. Her marriage to Maximilian represented both individual choice and systemic constraint, demonstrating how royal women could exercise personal preferences within limits established by political necessity and genetic heritage. The same bloodline concentration that made their union politically valuable also created risks for their descendants that contemporary science could neither predict nor prevent. The genetic patterns established by Marie's marriage would continue through subsequent generations, contributing to the Habsburg characteristics that would become both symbols of royal authority and evidence of genetic concentration. Her brief life thus represents a crucial moment in the development of European royal genetics, when individual choices combined with systemic pressures to create consequences that would affect subsequent generations. The evening light grows softer as we turn our attention to Anna of Austria, a woman whose marriage would represent perhaps the most extreme example of genetic concentration in Habsburg history. Her union with Philip II of Spain, her own uncle, embodied the dynasty's commitment to bloodline purity while also demonstrating the biological costs of such policies. Anna's birth in 1549 placed her at the center of Habsburg genetic concentration during its most intensive period. Her parents, Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, were themselves closely related, while her intended husband Philip II was her mother's brother, making their proposed marriage a union between uncle and niece that would concentrate Habsburg bloodlines to unprecedented levels. The political calculations that led to Anna's marriage reflected both imperial necessity and genetic assumptions that proved increasingly problematic. Philip II had been married 3 times previously, each union representing strategic alliances that failed to produce the stable succession that Spanish imperial interests required. Anna offered both genetic purity and youth that Habsburg advisors believed would ensure dynastic continuity. The age difference between Anna and Philip represented another challenge, common to royal marriages of the period. Anna was 17 when she married her uncle, who was 23 years her senior, and already experienced in imperial administration. Their relationship required her to adapt to both marital and political roles while navigating the complex court protocols that governed Spanish royal behavior. Anna's education had prepared her for queenship through instruction in multiple languages, diplomatic protocols, and religious devotion. Her correspondence reveals intellectual capabilities and political awareness that exceeded those of many contemporary royal women. Yet her role as queen was defined primarily by reproductive expectations rather than political participation. The genetic implications of Anna's marriage were immediately apparent in their children's health patterns. She bore 5 children to Philip, but only 4 survived infancy, and those who reached adulthood displayed varying degrees of health problems that may have reflected the extreme genetic concentration of their bloodlines. Philip III, their most famous son, inherited both political authority and genetic vulnerabilities that would affect his reign. Anna's personal health showed signs of the stress associated with both genetic concentration and the demanding role of Spanish queen. She suffered from recurring illnesses that contemporary physicians attributed to spiritual causes, but which modern medicine might classify as manifestations of autoimmune disorders or other conditions with genetic components. Her religious devotion represented both personal conviction and political necessity. Anna's piety was celebrated throughout the Spanish Empire as evidence of divine approval for Habsburg rule, while her charitable activities demonstrated the social responsibilities that accompanied royal status. Her private chapel contained one of the largest collections of religious relics in contemporary Europe. The political responsibilities that Anna assumed during Philip's absences required her to manage Spanish domestic affairs while maintaining the diplomatic relationships that supported imperial policy. Her correspondence with governors throughout the Spanish territories reveals administrative competence and political judgment that contributed to imperial stability during crucial periods. Yet Anna's role remained subordinate to her husband's political authority and constrained by the reproductive expectations that defined royal women's lives. Her value to the dynasty was measured primarily in terms of her ability to produce healthy heirs who could continue Habsburg rule, rather than her political capabilities or personal preferences. Her death in 1580 at age 31 followed complications from childbirth, a pattern that had claimed numerous Habsburg women whose bodies were expected to produce heirs regardless of their physical condition. Philip's grief was profound, but imperial necessity required him to consider remarriage arrangements that might produce additional heirs for dynastic security. The genetic legacy that Anna passed to her children represented both the culmination and the beginning of Habsburg genetic concentration. Her son Philip III inherited accumulated genetic load from generations of cousin marriages, while also displaying the physical characteristics that would become more pronounced in subsequent generations. Anna's story illustrates the human costs of genetic policies that prioritize dynastic purity over individual welfare. Her marriage to her uncle represented the logical extension of Habsburg breeding strategies, while also demonstrating the biological limits of such approaches to royal genetics. The political success of Anna's reign as queen contrasted sharply with the genetic risks that her marriage created for subsequent generations. She fulfilled her dynastic duties effectively while also contributing to the genetic concentration that would eventually produce the medical catastrophes associated with extreme Habsburg inbreeding. Her life demonstrates the complex relationship between individual agency and systemic constraints that characterized royal women's experiences. Anna exercised considerable influence within the limitations established by contemporary gender roles and genetic heritage, yet she remained subject to reproductive expectations that ultimately determined both her personal fate and her historical significance. As night approaches, we encounter Joanna of Austria, a woman whose life would demonstrate the possibilities available to royal women when political circumstances allowed them to exercise authority directly rather than merely through their reproductive functions. Her story illustrates both the capabilities that Habsburg women possessed and the genetic heritage that constrained their descendants' welfare. Juana's birth in 1535 made her the daughter of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal, placing her at the center of the most genetically concentrated royal bloodlines in contemporary Europe. Her parents' double first-cousin relationship had created genetic patterns that would influence her own health and her descendants' welfare in ways that contemporary medicine could neither predict nor address. The political education that Juana received prepared her for authority in ways that distinguished her from many contemporary royal women. She was fluent in multiple languages, familiar with diplomatic protocols, and educated in the administrative procedures that governed imperial territories. Her intellectual preparation would prove crucial during the political responsibilities that she would later assume. Her marriage to João Manuel of Portugal represented another loop in the increasingly complex web of Iberian royal genetics. João's bloodline included connections to both Spanish and Portuguese royal families, making their union another step in the concentration of royal characteristics that was becoming typical of Habsburg marriage policies. The brief duration of Juana's first marriage, ended by Jauré's death from illness within 2 years, left her widowed at 19 with a young son who would later become Sebastian of Portugal. Her decision to return to Spain rather than remain in Portugal to raise her child demonstrated both personal preference and political calculation that prioritized her own authority over maternal obligations. Juana's appointment as regent of Spain during Philip II's absence to marry Mary Tudor of England marked her emergence as a political figure in her own right. Her administration was characterized by fiscal responsibility, diplomatic competence, and cultural patronage that made Spain more prosperous and politically stable during her tenure. Her success challenged contemporary assumptions about women's political capabilities. The genetic heritage that Juana inherited from her parents created both advantages and vulnerabilities that influenced her descendants' welfare. Her son Sebastian grew up in Portugal under his grandmother's care, displaying signs of inherited characteristics that would affect his mental stability and political judgment. His eventual death in Morocco without heirs would lead to Portuguese incorporation into the Spanish Empire. Juana's decision to retire to a convent after her regency represented both religious conviction and political strategy. Her foundation of Las Descalzas Reales provided her with institutional authority and cultural influence that would have been impossible within the constraints of a second marriage. Her convent became a center for artistic patronage and religious devotion that influenced Spanish cultural development. Her never remarrying after her brief first marriage may have reflected both personal choice and recognition of the genetic risks associated with further concentration of Habsburg bloodlines. Her experience of widowhood and regency had demonstrated that royal women could exercise meaningful authority without subjecting themselves to the reproductive expectations that characterized most royal marriages. The political legacy of Juana's regency included successful management of Spanish domestic affairs during a critical period of imperial expansion. Her fiscal policies supported military campaigns in Italy and the Low Countries, while her diplomatic initiatives maintained alliances that secured Spanish interests throughout Europe. Yet her genetic legacy proved more problematic than her political achievements. Through her son Sebastian, the concentrated bloodlines that had created her own vulnerabilities passed to the Portuguese royal family, contributing to the instability that would eventually lead to Portuguese incorporation into the Spanish Empire. Juana's correspondence reveals a woman acutely aware of the genetic implications of royal marriage policies, while also committed to fulfilling her dynastic responsibilities. Her letters discussing potential marriages for her relatives demonstrate understanding of both political necessity and biological risk, though the balance between these considerations remained weighted toward political advantage. Her story illustrates the possibilities available to royal women when circumstances allowed them to exercise authority directly rather than merely through their reproductive functions. Juana's regency demonstrated political capabilities that exceeded those of many contemporary male rulers, yet her genetic heritage created constraints that affected her descendants' welfare regardless of her personal success. The convent that Juana founded continued to influence Spanish cultural development for centuries, providing education for noble women and patronage for artists whose work contributed to Spanish cultural achievements. Her institutional legacy thus extended beyond her immediate political accomplishments to encompass broader cultural influences. Her life demonstrates the complex relationship between individual capability and genetic heritage that characterized Habsburg royal women's experiences. Juana possessed remarkable political skills and intellectual curiosity, yet she remained bound by bloodline concentration and family expectations that influenced her descendants' welfare in ways that contemporary science could neither predict nor prevent. The moonlight casts silver patterns on the floor as we encounter Isabella Clara Eugenia, perhaps the last truly effective Habsburg ruler and a woman whose reign would demonstrate both the political possibilities and the genetic limitations that characterized the dynasty's final period of success. Her life embodied the contradiction between individual competence and systemic decline that marked the Habsburg experience. Isabella's birth in 1566 to Philip II and Anna of Austria placed her at the center of the most genetically concentrated royal bloodlines in European history. Her parents' uncle-niece relationship had created genetic patterns that miraculously seemed to have bypassed her own physical development while concentrating in ways that would affect subsequent generations. The political education that Isabella received prepared her for sovereignty in ways that few contemporary women could have imagined. She was fluent in Latin, French, and Italian, familiar with diplomatic protocols, and educated in the administrative procedures that governed the complex territories of the Spanish Netherlands. Her intellectual preparation exceeded that of many contemporary male rulers. Philip II's decision to grant Isabella and her husband Archduke Albert joint sovereignty over the Spanish Netherlands in 1598 represented both recognition of her capabilities and strategic necessity. The ongoing rebellion in the Low Countries required rulers who could balance military authority with diplomatic finesse, while the genetic implications of Habsburg bloodlines made fresh leadership essential. Isabella's marriage to Albert of Austria represented another careful balance between genetic risk and political necessity. Albert was her cousin through multiple Habsburg connections, making their union another step in the concentration of royal bloodlines, yet their relationship proved personally compatible and politically effective in ways that distinguished it from many contemporary royal marriages. Their joint rule of the Spanish Netherlands demonstrated the political possibilities available when royal women were granted genuine authority rather than merely ceremonial roles. Isabella's administration was marked by diplomatic innovation, fiscal responsibility, and cultural patronage that brought unprecedented prosperity and stability to a region that had been torn by religious warfare for decades. The genetic implications of Isabella's bloodline became apparent in her inability to produce children with Albert. Whether this childlessness resulted from genetic incompatibilities, medical problems, or personal choice remains unclear, but their lack of heirs represented both personal disappointment and political opportunity, allowing them to focus on governance rather than dynastic reproduction. Isabella's political methods combined traditional Habsburg authoritarianism with innovative approaches to religious toleration and economic development. Her policies encouraged trade, supported artistic innovation, and maintained delicate balances between Catholic orthodoxy and Protestant commercial interests that made the Spanish Netherlands one of Europe's most prosperous regions. Her personal interests included theatre, music, and scholarship, making her court a centre for cultural activity that influenced European artistic development. Isabella's patronage supported artists whose work contributed to what historians now recognize as the final flowering of Habsburg cultural achievement before the dynasty's genetic collapse became irreversible. The military responsibilities that Isabella assumed during the ongoing conflicts in the Low Countries required her to coordinate with Spanish commanders, while also maintaining diplomatic relationships with European powers whose interests sometimes conflicted with Spanish policy. Her success in balancing these competing demands demonstrated political skills that few contemporary rulers possessed. Albert's death in 1621 left Isabella as sole ruler of the Spanish Netherlands, a position that she maintained until her own death in 1633. Her single rule was marked by continued prosperity and stability, demonstrating that her earlier successes had resulted from her own capabilities rather than merely her husband's authority. The genetic legacy that Isabella represented included both the last expression of Habsburg political competence and the final concentration of bloodlines that would produce the medical catastrophes associated with extreme inbreeding. Her nephew Philip IV and his descendants would inherit the accumulated genetic load of generations of cousin marriages, while lacking her compensating political abilities. Isabella's correspondence reveals a woman acutely aware of the genetic implications of Habsburg marriage policies, while also committed to maintaining dynastic authority. Her letters discussing potential marriages for her relatives demonstrate understanding of both political necessity and biological risk, though contemporary science could provide no guidance for balancing these competing considerations. Her death in 1633 marked the end of effective Habsburg rule in the Spanish Netherlands and the beginning of the dynasty's irreversible decline. Later rulers would inherit her genetic heritage without her political capabilities, creating the conditions that would eventually lead to Habsburg extinction in Spain. Isabella Clara Eugenia's story illustrates the possibility that royal women could exercise meaningful political authority when circumstances permitted, while also demonstrating the genetic constraints that ultimately limited their dynasty's survival. Her reign represented both the pinnacle of Habsburg achievement and the beginning of its inevitable collapse. Her life demonstrates that individual competence could temporarily overcome systemic problems but could not prevent the long-term consequences of genetic concentration. Isabella's political success delayed but could not prevent the biological crisis that would destroy the Habsburg dynasty within 2 generations of her death. The cultural legacy that Isabella left in the Spanish Netherlands continued to influence European development long after the political structures that supported her rule had disappeared. Her patronage of arts and learning contributed to achievements that transcended the genetic limitations that constrained her dynasty's biological survival. The pre-dawn darkness surrounds us as we encounter Maria Theresa of Spain, a woman whose genetic heritage and political fate would intertwine to create one of the most significant cultural tensions in European history. Her marriage would bring concentrated Habsburg bloodlines into the heart of French court culture, creating conflicts between Spanish formality and French sophistication that would influence European development for generations. Maria Theresa's birth in 1638 to Philip IV and Elizabeth of France represented the convergence of multiple royal bloodlines that had been concentrating for generations. Her parents were first cousins, while her grandparents and great-grandparents had married within increasingly narrow circles of European royalty, creating genetic patterns that would influence both her personal characteristics and her descendants' welfare. The political calculations that determined Maria Theresa's matrimonial fate reflected both the international balance of power and the genetic assumptions that guided royal marriage policies. Her betrothal to Louis XIV of France was intended to cement the peace of the Pyrenees while also bringing Spanish Habsburg bloodlines into the French royal family for the first time. Maria Theresa's education had prepared her for Spanish queenship rather than French court culture, creating personal and political challenges that would define her entire married life. Her religious devotion, linguistic preferences and cultural expectations differed significantly from the secular sophistication that characterized Versailles during Louis XIV's reign. The wedding ceremony in 1660 was celebrated throughout Europe as the union of two compatible bloodlines that would create lasting peace between France and Spain. Contemporary observers noted the physical similarities between bride and groom, commenting upon shared facial characteristics and family resemblances that modern genetics would interpret as evidence of dangerous genetic concentration. Maria Theresa's early years at Versailles revealed the cultural and personal challenges facing Spanish princesses who married into French royalty. She struggled with court protocols that differed from her Spanish upbringing, language barriers that affected her political influence, and social expectations that conflicted with her religious convictions. The genetic heritage that Maria Theresa brought to France created both political opportunities and medical risks that would influence French royal succession for generations. Her Habsburg bloodlines introduced new genetic elements into French royalty, while also concentrating characteristics that would become more pronounced in subsequent generations. Her pregnancy history illustrated both the promises and the perils of genetically concentrated royal marriages. She bore 6 children to Louis XIV, but only one, the Grand Dauphin, survived to adulthood, while the others died in infancy from causes that contemporary medicine could neither understand nor prevent. The high rate of infant mortality may have reflected genetic incompatibilities between French and Spanish royal bloodlines. Maria Theresa's personal relationship with Louis XIV was complicated by his numerous mistresses and her own cultural isolation at the French court. Her letters reveal emotional distress at his infidelities and homesickness for Spanish court culture, yet also recognition of her political importance as the link between French and Spanish royal families. The political responsibilities that Maria Theresa was expected to fulfill required her to represent Spanish interests within the French court, while also supporting Louis XIV's domestic and international policies. Her position as queen consort provided ceremonial authority but limited political influence over decisions that affected both French and Spanish welfare. Her religious devotion provided both personal consolation and political difficulty at a court that was becoming increasingly secular in its cultural orientation. Maria Theresa's Spanish Catholicism differed from French religious practices in ways that created tensions with courtiers who viewed her piety as evidence of foreign influence. The cultural differences between Maria Theresa and the French court extended beyond religious practices to encompass attitudes toward entertainment, social interaction, and political participation. Her Spanish upbringing had emphasized formal protocols and religious observance rather than the wit and sophistication that characterized French aristocratic culture. Her death in 1683 at age 44 followed complications from an infected arm, but contemporary accounts suggest that her health had been declining for years due to the stresses of cultural isolation and reproductive expectations. Louis XIV's famous comment that she had never caused him pain except by dying reveals both the emotional distance and the political functionality that characterized their marriage. The genetic legacy that Maria Theresa passed to French royalty included both Spanish Habsburg characteristics and the accumulated vulnerabilities associated with concentrated royal bloodlines. Her son, the Grand Dauphin, would inherit both political authority and genetic traits that would influence French royal succession through subsequent generations. Maria Theresa's story illustrates the cultural costs of genetic policies that treated royal women as repositories of bloodline characteristics rather than individuals whose personal preferences and cultural backgrounds deserved consideration. Her isolation at the French court resulted from systematic differences that reflected centuries of separate dynastic development. Her life demonstrates the complex relationship between individual adaptation and cultural constraint that characterized royal women's experiences when they married into foreign courts. Maria Theresa's Spanish heritage created both political value and personal difficulty within French court culture, illustrating the human costs of diplomatic marriages. The political legacy of Maria Theresa's marriage included the permanent introduction of Spanish genetic elements into French royalty, creating bloodline patterns that would influence European development through the 18th century and beyond. Her descendants would carry both French political traditions and Spanish genetic characteristics that would affect their personal welfare and political effectiveness. Dawn light begins to filter through the windows as we encounter Elizabeth of Valois, a woman whose brief life would demonstrate both the possibilities and the limitations that confronted royal women during the height of European dynastic politics. Her marriage would bring French bloodlines into the Spanish Habsburg family, while also illustrating the genetic risks associated with continued royal intermarriage. Elizabeth's birth in 1545 to Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici placed her at the center of French expansion and religious conflict. Her parents represented the convergence of Valois royal traditions and Italian political sophistication, creating a genetic and cultural heritage that would prove attractive to Spanish marriage negotiators seeking to balance Habsburg concentration with fresh bloodline elements. The political calculations that led to Elizabeth's marriage reflected both international necessity and genetic assumptions about the benefits of introducing new bloodlines into royal families. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis required a French marriage to seal peace between France and Spain, while Philip II needed a wife whose genetic heritage might counteract the accumulating problems associated with Habsburg intermarriage. Elizabeth's education had prepared her for French queenship through instruction in multiple languages, diplomatic protocols, and the cultural sophistication that characterized Valois court life. Her intellectual preparation included both classical scholarship and practical political knowledge that would prove valuable during her brief reign as Queen of Spain. The age difference between Elizabeth and Philip II represented a typical pattern in royal marriages of the period. Yet their relationship appears to have developed into genuine affection despite the political calculations that had created it. Contemporary accounts describe mutual attraction and emotional compatibility that distinguished their marriage from many purely ceremonial royal unions. Elizabeth's arrival at the Spanish court in 1560 brought French cultural elements into Habsburg court life, while also introducing genetic material that Spanish advisors hoped would strengthen royal bloodlines. Her beauty, intelligence, and sophisticated manners made her popular with Spanish courtiers who appreciated the cultural refinement that she represented. The genetic implications of Elizabeth's marriage became apparent in her reproductive history, which included multiple pregnancies but only 2 daughters who survived infancy. Isabel Clara Eugenia and Catalina Michaela would inherit both their mother's French characteristics and their father's Spanish Habsburg traits, creating genetic combinations that would influence subsequent generations. Elizabeth's personal interests included literature, music, and scholarship, making her court a center for cultural activity that influenced Spanish artistic development. Her patronage supported French and Spanish artists whose work contributed to the cultural flowering that characterized Philip II's reign during its most successful period. The political responsibilities that Elizabeth assumed as Queen of Spain required her to represent French interests within the Spanish court, while also supporting Philip's domestic and international policies. Her correspondence reveals diplomatic skill and political awareness that contributed to Spanish-French relations during a crucial period of European development. Her religious devotion reflected both personal conviction and political necessity, as Spanish queens were expected to demonstrate Catholic orthodoxy while also maintaining diplomatic relationships with Protestant powers. Elizabeth's ability to balance these competing demands demonstrated political sophistication that exceeded that of many contemporary royal women. The cultural influence that Elizabeth exercised at the Spanish court extended beyond her immediate political responsibilities to encompass broader questions of artistic patronage, intellectual development, and social innovation. Her French heritage brought new perspectives to Spanish court culture, while also creating opportunities for cultural exchange between the two kingdoms. Her death in 1568 at age 23 followed complications from childbirth, a pattern that had claimed numerous royal women whose bodies were expected to produce heirs regardless of their physical condition. Philip's genuine grief at her loss was noted by contemporary observers, suggesting that their marriage had achieved both political success and personal satisfaction. The genetic legacy that Elizabeth passed to her daughters represented a successful combination of French and Spanish royal characteristics that would influence European development for generations. Isabel Clara Eugenia's later political success as ruler of the Spanish Netherlands demonstrated the benefits that could result from introducing fresh genetic elements into concentrated royal bloodlines. Elizabeth's story illustrates the potential benefits of genetic diversity in royal marriage policies while also demonstrating the personal costs that such policies imposed upon individual women. Her brief life achieved both political success and personal fulfillment within the constraints established by contemporary dynastic requirements. Her marriage to Philip II represented one of the more successful attempts to balance genetic concentration with bloodline diversity. Yet her early death prevented full realization of the benefits that such policies might have provided. Her daughters would inherit both her genetic advantages and the accumulated vulnerabilities associated with Habsburg concentration. The cultural legacy that Elizabeth left in Spain continued to influence artistic and intellectual development long after her death, demonstrating how royal women could exercise cultural authority that transcended their immediate political roles. Her French heritage contributed to Spanish cultural achievements while also maintaining diplomatic relationships that benefited both kingdoms. The morning sun grows stronger as we encounter Barbara of Austria, a woman whose life would illustrate the complex relationships between genetic heritage, political authority, and personal agency that characterized royal women's experiences during the height of Habsburg power. Her story demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations that confronted noble women who sought to exercise influence within systems designed to constrain their authority. Barbara's birth in 1539 to Ferdinand I of Bohemia and Hungary placed her within the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family at a time when genetic concentration was becoming increasingly apparent in royal bloodlines. Her parents were cousins whose marriage had continued the pattern of intermarriage that characterized Habsburg dynastic policies, creating genetic inheritance patterns that would influence her descendants' welfare. The political education that Barbara received prepared her for the complex diplomatic responsibilities that would characterize her married life. She was fluent in multiple languages, familiar with the administrative procedures that governed imperial territories, and educated in the cultural protocols that facilitated international relations during a period of religious and political conflict. Her marriage to Alfonso II d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, represented another careful balance between genetic risk and political necessity. Alfonso's bloodlines included connections to multiple Italian noble families as well as more distant Habsburg relationships, making their union another step in the gradual concentration of European noble genetics, while also serving immediate political requirements. Barbara's arrival in Ferrara brought Austrian Habsburg administrative methods to Italian territorial governance, while also introducing genetic material that would influence Italian noble bloodlines for generations. Her court became a center for cultural activity that combined Austrian traditions with Italian artistic innovation, creating cultural synthesis that influenced European development. The political responsibilities that Barbara assumed as Duchess of Ferrara required her to balance imperial loyalty with Italian territorial interests, while also managing the complex relationships between Catholic orthodoxy and Renaissance cultural innovation. Her success in maintaining these delicate balances demonstrated political skills that exceeded those of many contemporary male rulers. Barbara's personal interests included astrology, scholarship, and artistic patronage, making her court a center for intellectual activity that attracted scholars and artists from throughout Europe. Her correspondence with leading humanists reveals intellectual curiosity and cultural sophistication that distinguished her from many contemporary noble women. The genetic heritage that Barbara inherited from her Habsburg ancestry created both political advantages and personal vulnerabilities that affected her health and her descendants' welfare. She suffered from recurring illnesses that contemporary physicians attributed to climatic factors, but which modern medicine might classify as manifestations of autoimmune disorders or other conditions with genetic components. Her marriage to Alfonso appears to have been personally compatible despite the political calculations that had created it, yet their inability to produce surviving children created both personal disappointment and political problems for Ferrarese succession. Whether their childlessness resulted from genetic incompatibilities or other medical factors remains unclear from historical records. Barbara's administrative methods combined Habsburg bureaucratic efficiency with Italian diplomatic flexibility, creating governmental systems that maintained Ferrarese independence while also satisfying imperial requirements. Her political success demonstrated the capabilities that royal women could exercise when circumstances allowed them to assume genuine authority. Her cultural patronage supported artistic and intellectual achievements that contributed to the Renaissance flowering in northern Italy, while also maintaining connections to imperial cultural traditions. Barbara's court attracted musicians, scholars, and artists whose work influenced European cultural development during a crucial period of intellectual innovation. The diplomatic relationships that Barbara maintained with other Italian powers required her to balance competing interests while also upholding Habsburg family policies that sometimes conflicted with Ferrarese territorial requirements. Her success in managing these complex relationships demonstrated political sophistication that few contemporary women possessed. Her death in 1572 at age 32 ended a political career that had successfully balanced competing interests while also contributing to cultural achievements that transcended immediate political boundaries. Barbara's legacy included both political innovations and cultural contributions that influenced Italian development for generations. The genetic patterns that Barbara represented included both the political advantages and the medical risks associated with Habsburg bloodline concentration. Her descendants would inherit both her administrative capabilities and the accumulated genetic vulnerabilities that would become more apparent in subsequent generations. Barbara's story illustrates the possibilities available to royal women when political circumstances allowed them to exercise meaningful authority, while also demonstrating the genetic constraints that limited their descendants' welfare. Her reign as Duchess of Ferrara achieved both political success and cultural innovation within the limitations established by contemporary gender roles and genetic heritage. Her correspondence reveals a woman acutely aware of the political implications of her marriage and succession policies, while also committed to maintaining cultural standards that transcended immediate dynastic requirements. Barbara's intellectual interests and administrative competence demonstrated capabilities that challenged contemporary assumptions about women's political limitations. The institutional legacy that Barbara established in Ferrara continued to influence Italian political development long after the genetic patterns that had created her own vulnerabilities had produced more severe consequences in subsequent generations. Her administrative innovations and cultural patronage contributed to achievements that outlasted the political structures that had supported her authority. The afternoon light casts long shadows as we encounter Constance of Aragon, a woman whose life would bridge the gap between medieval and early modern royal marriage policies, while demonstrating the early stages of genetic concentration that would later characterize European royal families. Her story illustrates both the political necessities and the biological consequences that drove royal intermarriage during the formative period of European dynastic development. Constance's birth in 1179 to Alfonso II of Aragon and Sancha of Castile placed her within Iberian royal bloodlines that had already begun the process of genetic concentration through strategic cousin marriages designed to consolidate territorial control. Her parents' relationship represented typical medieval royal marriage policies that prioritized political advantage over genetic diversity, establishing patterns that would intensify in subsequent generations. The political education that Constance received prepared her for the complex international relationships that would define her married life. Medieval royal women were expected to understand diplomatic protocols, manage household economies, and represent dynastic interests in foreign courts, requiring intellectual preparation that exceeded that available to most contemporary women. Her marriage to Frederick II, heir to the Kingdom of Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire, represented a strategic alliance between Iberian and Germanic power structures, while also creating genetic connections that would influence European royal bloodlines for centuries. Frederick's own complex inheritance included both German imperial traditions and Sicilian cultural influences that would affect their children's political and genetic heritage. Constance's arrival in Sicily brought Iberian administrative methods to Mediterranean governance, while also introducing genetic material that would influence the Hohenstaufen bloodline. Her court became a center for cultural synthesis that combined Spanish traditions with German imperial practices and Sicilian artistic innovation, creating unique cultural achievements. The political responsibilities that Constance assumed as Queen of Sicily required her to balance competing interests while supporting Frederick's complex imperial ambitions. Her regency during Frederick's absences demonstrated administrative competence and political judgment that contributed to Sicilian stability during periods of imperial conflict throughout Europe. Constance's personal interests included astronomy and scholarship, making her court a center for intellectual activity that attracted scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world. Her patronage supported cultural achievements that contributed to the medieval synthesis of classical learning with contemporary political requirements. The genetic implications of Constance's marriage became apparent in her children's health patterns and political development. Her son Henry VII of Germany would later rebel against his father and die in prison, possibly by suicide, displaying behavioral patterns that might have reflected inherited psychological vulnerabilities exacerbated by political pressures. Her administrative methods combined Iberian bureaucratic traditions with Germanic imperial practices, creating governmental systems that maintained Sicilian prosperity while also satisfying imperial requirements. Constance's political success demonstrated the capabilities that medieval royal women could exercise when circumstances allowed them to assume genuine authority. The cultural influence that Constance exercised in Sicily extended beyond immediate political responsibilities to encompass broader questions of intellectual development and artistic patronage. Her Spanish heritage brought new perspectives to Mediterranean culture while also creating opportunities for cultural exchange between diverse European traditions. Her death in 1222 ended a political career that had successfully balanced competing interests while also contributing to cultural achievements that transcended immediate dynastic boundaries. Constance's legacy included both political innovations and genetic contributions that would influence European development for generations. The genetic patterns that Constance represented included early stages of the bloodline concentration that would later characterize European royal families. Her descendants would inherit both her political capabilities and the genetic foundations that would contribute to more severe concentration in subsequent generations. Constance's story illustrates the transition from medieval to early modern royal marriage policies, while demonstrating how individual capabilities could temporarily overcome systemic limitations. Her reign as Queen of Sicily achieved both political success and cultural innovation within the constraints established by medieval gender roles and emerging genetic patterns. Her correspondence reveals a woman committed to maintaining cultural standards while also fulfilling political responsibilities that required balancing competing dynastic interests. Constance's intellectual curiosity and administrative competence challenged contemporary assumptions about women's political capabilities while also establishing precedents for later royal women. The institutional legacy that Constance established in Sicily continued to influence Mediterranean political development, while also contributing to the genetic patterns that would later produce both political advantages and medical problems in European royal families. Her innovations in governance and culture outlasted the immediate political structures that had supported her authority. The late afternoon sun illuminates dust motes in the air, as we encounter Margaret of York, a woman whose marriage would demonstrate the complex relationships between English political development and continental European genetic concentration. Her story illustrates how royal women could influence international politics through marriage alliances while also contributing to the bloodline patterns that would later characterize Habsburg dominance. Margaret's birth in 1446 to Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville placed her at the center of English civil conflict during the Wars of the Roses. Her family's struggle for political authority required strategic international alliances that would secure English territorial claims while also providing military support for domestic political conflicts. The political education that Margaret received prepared her for the diplomatic responsibilities that would characterize her role as a link between English and continental European power structures. She was educated in multiple languages, familiar with international protocols, and trained in the cultural skills that facilitated dynastic marriage negotiations during a period of European political instability. Her marriage to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, in 1468, represented a strategic alliance that connected English territorial claims with Burgundian commercial interests, while also introducing English genetic material into continental European royal bloodlines. The marriage created political relationships that would influence European development for generations. Margaret's arrival in Burgundy brought English administrative methods to Low Countries governance, while also establishing cultural connections that would influence both English and continental European development. Her court became a centre for international diplomatic activity that facilitated communication between diverse European power structures. The political responsibilities that Margaret assumed as Duchess of Burgundy required her to manage complex territorial relationships, while also supporting her husband's military ambitions. Her administrative competence and diplomatic skills contributed to Burgundian prosperity during a period of international conflict that threatened regional stability. Charles the Bold's death in battle in 1477 left Margaret as a widow with significant political influence over Burgundian succession decisions. Her support for the marriage between her stepdaughter Marie of Burgundy and Maximilian of Austria would prove crucial to Habsburg territorial expansion and genetic development. Margaret's role in arranging Marie's marriage to Maximilian represented a pivotal moment in European political development, bringing Burgundian territories into the Habsburg Empire while also introducing additional genetic elements into royal bloodlines that were already showing signs of concentration. Her political judgment would influence European development for centuries. Her decision to remain in the Low Countries after becoming a widow demonstrated both personal preference and political calculation that prioritized her influence over Burgundian affairs, rather than potential remarriage arrangements that might have provided personal security but reduced her political authority. Margaret's cultural interests included religious devotion and scholarly patronage, making her court a centre for intellectual activity that supported both religious reform and humanist scholarship. Her correspondence with leading intellectuals reveals cultural sophistication that influenced both English and continental European development. The genetic implications of Margaret's marriage policies became apparent in the bloodline concentration that characterized her descendants' marriages. Her influence over Burgundian succession decisions contributed to the Habsburg genetic patterns that would later produce both political dominance and medical problems. Her administrative methods combined English governmental traditions with Burgundian commercial practices, creating institutional innovations that influenced Low Countries' development, while also maintaining connections to English political interests. Margaret's governmental success demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of many contemporary male rulers. The diplomatic relationships that Margaret maintained with European powers required her to balance competing interests while also supporting Habsburg dynastic policies that sometimes conflicted with English territorial requirements. Her success in managing these complex relationships demonstrated political sophistication that few contemporary women possessed. Her death in 1503 ended a political career that had successfully influenced European territorial development while also contributing to genetic patterns that would affect subsequent generations. Margaret's legacy included both institutional innovations and bloodline contributions that would influence European political development. The cultural legacy that Margaret established in the Low Countries continued to influence European intellectual development, while also contributing to the administrative methods that would support Habsburg territorial expansion. Her patronage of scholarship and religious reform outlasted the immediate political structures that had supported her authority. Margaret's story illustrates how individual political judgment could influence European development, while also demonstrating the genetic consequences of marriage policies that prioritized political advantage over biological diversity. Her decisions regarding Burgundian succession created both political opportunities and genetic risks that would affect subsequent generations. Her correspondence reveals a woman committed to maintaining political influence while also fulfilling cultural responsibilities that required balancing competing dynastic interests. Margaret's intellectual interests and administrative competence established precedents for later royal women, while also contributing to genetic patterns that would later produce both benefits and problems. The evening shadows deepen as we encounter the complex web of relationships surrounding Marie Antoinette's grandmothers, women whose genetic heritage and political decisions would create the bloodline patterns that produced one of history's most famous royal victims. Their stories illustrate how multiple generations of strategic intermarriage created both political opportunities and genetic vulnerabilities that would influence European development through the Revolutionary period. Elizabeth Farnese's birth in 1692 to Odoardo Farnese, Duke of Parma, and Dorothea Sophie of Neuburg placed her within Italian noble bloodlines that had already begun concentrating through strategic marriages designed to preserve territorial integrity. Her parents were cousins whose relationship represented typical early modern marriage policies that prioritized political alliance over genetic diversity. The political calculations that led to Elizabeth's marriage to Philip Thefts of Spain reflected both international necessity and genetic assumptions about the benefits of introducing Italian bloodlines into Spanish Habsburg inheritance patterns. Their union would bring Farnese territorial claims into Spanish royal succession, while also contributing to the genetic complexity that would characterize later European royal families. Elizabeth's emergence as the dominant political figure in early 18th century Spain demonstrated the authority that royal women could exercise when personal capability combined with favorable political circumstances. Her influence over Spanish domestic and international policy exceeded that of most contemporary male rulers, challenging traditional assumptions about women's political limitations. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria was creating her own complex legacy through marriage policies that balanced Habsburg genetic concentration with strategic territorial alliances. Her 16 children would be deployed throughout European courts in marriage arrangements, designed to maintain Habsburg influence while also introducing fresh genetic elements into royal bloodlines. Maria Theresa's administrative competence and political judgment enabled her to rule the Austrian Empire effectively, while also managing the complex diplomatic relationships that supported Habsburg territorial claims. Her success as a ruler demonstrated capabilities that challenged contemporary gender assumptions while also establishing precedents for later royal women. The genetic implications of these marriage policies became apparent in the health patterns and political development of subsequent generations. Marie Antoinette's inheritance included both the political sophistication and the genetic vulnerabilities that characterized her maternal ancestry, creating personal characteristics that would influence her historical fate. Maria Theresa Raphael of Spain represented another link in the genetic chain that would produce Marie Antoinette's bloodline patterns. Her brief life and early death from childbirth complications illustrated the reproductive pressures that confronted royal women whose genetic heritage created both political value and medical risks. The cultural influence that these women exercised extended beyond immediate political responsibilities to encompass broader questions of artistic patronage, intellectual development, and social innovation. Their courts became centers for cultural activity that influenced European development during the crucial period preceding the French Revolution. Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel contributed additional genetic elements to the Habsburg bloodline through her marriage to Emperor Charles VI, creating inheritance patterns that would influence Maria Theresa's political development and Marie Antoinette's personal characteristics. Her genetic contribution included both political advantages and medical vulnerabilities that would affect subsequent generations. The political legacy of these marriages included the complex diplomatic relationships that would influence European development through the Revolutionary period and beyond. The genetic patterns that they established would create both opportunities and constraints for their descendants, including Marie Antoinette, whose personal characteristics reflected centuries of strategic intermarriage. Their stories illustrate the multi-generational nature of royal genetic policies and their consequences for both individual welfare and political stability. The same marriage strategies that had created political advantages for earlier generations would contribute to the personal vulnerabilities and political problems that would ultimately destroy the monarchy that they had been designed to preserve. The correspondence and cultural activities of these women reveal intellectual capabilities and political sophistication that exceeded contemporary expectations while also demonstrating awareness of the genetic implications of their marriage policies. Their decisions balanced political necessity with personal preference within constraints established by dynastic requirements and genetic heritage. The institutional legacies that they established continued to influence European political development, while also contributing to the cultural achievements that characterized the pre-revolutionary period. Their patronage of arts and learning created cultural foundations that would survive the political upheavals that would destroy the dynastic structures they had been designed to support. The night deepens as we turn our attention to the hidden chambers where royal women endured the most private consequences of dynastic policies, the miscarriages, stillbirths, and mysterious illnesses that were whispered about in palace corridors but rarely recorded in official histories. These intimate tragedies reveal the human cost of genetic concentration more clearly than any political narrative could convey. Behind the velvet curtains and golden ceremonies lay a different reality: royal women whose bodies were expected to produce heirs regardless of their genetic heritage or personal health. Catherine of Aragon's reproductive history exemplified this pattern, with at least 6 documented pregnancies that produced only 1 surviving child. Her other pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death, creating personal anguish and political crisis that would reshape English religious history. The medical understanding available to royal physicians provided no explanation for these reproductive failures beyond vague references to humoral imbalances or spiritual causes. Catherine herself believed that God was punishing her for some unknown sin, a belief reinforced by religious advisors who interpreted her pregnancy losses as evidence of divine displeasure with her marriage. Contemporary medical practices offered treatments that were both ineffective and potentially dangerous. Bloodletting to balance the humors, herbal remedies of questionable value, and religious rituals designed to ensure divine favor for future pregnancies. Royal women were subjected to these interventions repeatedly, often weakening their health further while providing no real medical benefit. The pattern of pregnancy loss was repeated throughout royal families whose bloodlines had been concentrated through generations of cousin marriage. Isabella of Portugal, Anna of Austria, and Barbara of Austria all experienced multiple miscarriages and infant deaths that may have reflected genetic incompatibilities created by their parents' close relationships. Modern medical understanding suggests that some of these reproductive problems may have resulted from road incompatibility, genetic disorders that increased the risk of birth defects, or inherited conditions that affected immune system function. The same genetic concentration that made these women politically valuable also made them medically vulnerable to conditions that outbred populations might have avoided. The psychological toll of repeated pregnancy loss was compounded by the political pressure to produce male heirs who could continue dynastic succession. Royal women who failed to produce surviving sons faced not only personal grief but also political marginalization and potential replacement through divorce or annulment proceedings. The mystery ailments that affected royal women created additional layers of suffering that were rarely acknowledged in official records. Chronic headaches, muscle weakness, recurring fevers, and episodes of what contemporary physicians termed hysteria may have reflected inherited conditions that were exacerbated by the stresses of court life and reproductive expectations. Some royal women experienced symptoms that modern medicine might classify as autoimmune disorders, neurological conditions, or inherited blood disorders. These illnesses were often attributed to spiritual causes or moral failings rather than medical conditions, creating additional psychological burdens for women who were already struggling with physical problems. The treatments available for these conditions were largely ineffective and sometimes harmful. Royal physicians prescribed bloodletting, purging, and toxic herbal preparations that may have worsened rather than improved their patients' conditions. Religious treatments, including exorcism, were sometimes attempted when medical interventions failed. The isolation that accompanied illness created additional psychological stress for royal women who were already separated from their families and cultural backgrounds through marriage alliances. Sick queens were often confined to private chambers where they had little contact with anyone except physicians and religious advisors, creating conditions that may have worsened depression and anxiety. The children who survived the genetic lottery faced their own health challenges that reflected their parents' concentrated bloodlines. Royal infants were frequently born with what were euphemistically termed delicate constitutions, requiring constant medical attention and often failing to develop normally despite the best available care. The accumulation of recessive genetic traits through generations of intermarriage created increasing risks for birth defects, developmental delays, and early death. Royal families developed elaborate rituals around infant care that reflected their awareness of these risks while also attempting to maintain public confidence in dynastic stability. The emotional impact of these experiences on royal women can only be imagined through fragmentary references in their correspondence and the observations of contemporary witnesses. The combination of personal grief, political pressure, and medical ignorance created psychological burdens that few people could have endured without lasting trauma. These hidden tragedies represent the most personal cost of royal genetic policies that prioritize political advantage over individual welfare. The same dynastic strategies that created political power also created medical vulnerabilities that claimed countless lives and caused immeasurable suffering for the women who were expected to bear and raise the next generation of European royalty. The dawn light reveals new horrors as we examine the most visible consequence of royal genetic concentration, the infamous Habsburg jaw and its associated deformities. This mandibular prognathism became not merely a physical characteristic but a symbol of the biological costs that accompanied dynastic ambition. The Habsburg jaw, technically known as mandibular prognathism, developed over generations as a direct result of repeated intermarriage within the same bloodlines. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed that the severity of this condition correlated directly with the degree of inbreeding in individual family trees, creating a measurable relationship between political policy and physical deformity. Early manifestations of the jaw appeared relatively mild in portraits of 15th and 16th century Habsburg women, but the condition became progressively more pronounced as genetic concentration increased through subsequent generations. Artists often attempted to minimize the appearance of the jaw through careful positioning and shadow techniques, but the underlying bone structure could not be disguised entirely. Isabella Clara Eugenia displayed moderate jaw protrusion that was barely noticeable in her official portraits, yet her descendants would inherit increasingly severe versions of the condition. By the time of Mariana of Austria, the jaw had become so pronounced that contemporary observers commented on it, despite court protocol that normally ignored royal physical flaws. The physical consequences of severe mandibular prognathism extended far beyond cosmetic concerns to encompass serious functional problems. Affected individuals had difficulty chewing food, speaking clearly, and breathing normally, creating health problems that affected their daily lives and political effectiveness. Women with the Habsburg jaw faced particular challenges because beauty standards of their era emphasized facial symmetry and feminine delicacy. The pronounced jaw created masculine facial characteristics that were considered unattractive and potentially indicative of moral or spiritual defects, adding social stigma to physical discomfort. The genetic mechanism that produced the Habsburg jaw also created other facial abnormalities, including widely spaced eyes, elongated noses, and drooping eyelids. These characteristics combined to create a distinctive family appearance that became both a mark of royal status and evidence of genetic concentration. Contemporary physicians had no understanding of the genetic causes of these deformities and attributed them to everything from divine displeasure to maternal impressions during pregnancy. Treatments included mechanical devices designed to reshape facial bones, herbal preparations, and religious interventions that were both ineffective and potentially harmful. The progression of jaw severity through successive generations can be traced through portrait analysis and contemporary descriptions that document the increasing prominence of the condition. Charles II of Spain represented the extreme endpoint of this genetic concentration, with jaw deformity so severe that he could not chew solid food or speak intelligibly. The Habsburg jaw became a subject of satire and political commentary throughout Europe, with cartoonists exaggerating the deformity to mock Spanish royal pretensions. This cultural response transformed a medical condition into a political symbol that represented the dangers of excessive inbreeding and dynastic isolation. Modern medical analysis has revealed that the Habsburg jaw was accompanied by other genetic problems, including increased susceptibility to certain diseases, fertility issues, and developmental abnormalities. The visible jaw deformity was merely the most obvious manifestation of broader genetic problems that affected overall health and survival. The women who carried the Habsburg jaw faced not only physical discomfort, but also social stigma and reproductive challenges that affected their political effectiveness and personal happiness. Their experiences illustrate the human cost of genetic policies that treated individual welfare as secondary to dynastic requirements. Some Habsburg women attempted to minimize the appearance of their jaw through cosmetic techniques, including special positioning for portraits, careful selection of clothing styles, and behavioral modifications designed to reduce the visibility of their condition. These efforts demonstrate their awareness of the social implications of their genetic inheritance. The cultural impact of the Habsburg jaw extended beyond immediate political consequences to influence broader European attitudes toward royal genetics and marriage policies. The visible evidence of genetic concentration created public awareness of the biological risks associated with excessive inbreeding, contributing to gradual changes in royal marriage practices. The scientific study of the Habsburg jaw has provided modern geneticists with one of the most clear examples of how specific traits can be concentrated through repeated intermarriage, offering insights into human genetics that extend far beyond royal family histories. The debate among scholars continues as we examine the broader question of whether genetic concentration truly caused the decline of European royal dynasties or merely provided convenient explanations for political and economic failures that had more complex causes. This academic controversy reflects deeper questions about the relationship between biology and political power. Some historians argue that the medical problems associated with royal inbreeding have been exaggerated by later observers, who sought to explain dynastic failures through simple biological causes, rather than acknowledging more complex political, economic, and social factors that contributed to royal decline. The evidence for genetic influence includes measurable increases in birth defects, infant mortality, and adult health problems in royal families whose marriage patterns created high levels of inbreeding. Statistical analysis of royal genealogies reveals clear correlations between genetic concentration and medical problems that cannot be explained by chance alone. Counter-arguments emphasize that royal families throughout Europe faced similar challenges regardless of their genetic heritage, including high infant mortality rates, recurring epidemics, and limited medical knowledge that made survival difficult for everyone, not just the inbred. The special attention paid to royal health problems may have created the appearance of genetic crisis when the actual situation was typical for the period. Modern geneticists have calculated inbreeding coefficients for various royal families, providing mathematical measures of genetic concentration that can be compared with health outcomes and political effectiveness. These calculations reveal that some royal individuals had genetic concentration levels equivalent to the offspring of siblings, creating unprecedented biological risks. The debate extends to questions about individual cases of alleged mental illness or physical disability among royal family members. Modern medical knowledge suggests that some conditions attributed to inbreeding may have had other causes, while some symptoms dismissed as character flaws may have reflected genuine genetic problems. Political historians emphasize that dynastic failures often resulted from external pressures including warfare, economic crisis, and social change, rather than internal genetic problems. The Spanish Habsburg collapse, for example, coincided with military defeats, colonial rebellions, and fiscal crisis that would have challenged any ruling family regardless of their genetic heritage. Yet the timing of genetic crisis and political decline suggests more than coincidental correlation. The most severely inbred royal individuals often proved incapable of effective rule, creating political instability that external pressures could exploit more easily than would have been possible with competent leadership. The medical evidence includes not only physical deformities but also fertility problems that threatened dynastic succession directly. Royal couples who could not produce viable heirs created succession crises that destabilized entire kingdoms regardless of their political or economic competence in other areas. Contemporary observers were aware of the relationship between close intermarriage and health problems, though they lacked modern genetic theory to explain the mechanisms involved. Papal dispensations for cousin marriages became increasingly difficult to obtain as church authorities recognized the problems associated with excessive inbreeding. The cultural impact of genetic concentration extended beyond immediate political consequences to influence European attitudes toward marriage, heredity, and political legitimacy. The visible evidence of royal genetic problems contributed to changing ideas about the relationship between bloodline purity and political authority. The scholarly consensus appears to support a multi-factor explanation that acknowledges both genetic and political contributions to royal decline. Genetic concentration created individual vulnerabilities that political and economic pressures could exploit, while external challenges exposed the weaknesses created by generations of intermarriage. The women at the center of these genetic policies were both agents and victims of systems that they could neither fully understand nor effectively resist. Their personal experiences of illness, reproductive failure, and early death provide the most compelling evidence for the human costs of dynastic genetics, regardless of their broader political implications. The moon rises as we witness the final act of Habsburg genetic concentration in the pathetic figure of Charles II of Spain, whose very existence embodied the ultimate consequences of centuries of strategic intermarriage. His story represents not merely individual tragedy, but the collapse of an entire approach to royal genetics that had shaped European politics for generations. Charles II's birth in 1661 to Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who was Philip's own niece, created genetic concentration unprecedented in European royal history. His inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 meant that he was more closely related to himself than most siblings are to each other, representing the mathematical endpoint of Habsburg marriage policies. The physical manifestations of genetic concentration were apparent from Charles's birth. He could not speak until age 4, could not walk properly until age 8, and never developed the mental or physical capabilities expected of a functioning adult, much less a ruling monarch. His survival to age 39 was considered miraculous by contemporary physicians. The Habsburg jaw reached its most extreme development in Charles, creating facial deformity so severe that he could not chew solid food properly and required specially prepared meals throughout his life. His speech was so impaired that court interpreters were needed to translate his attempts at communication even in his native Spanish. His physical appearance shocked contemporary observers who were accustomed to seeing royal genetic problems, but had never witnessed such extreme manifestations. Diplomatic reports describe a monarch who drooled constantly, had difficulty maintaining his balance, and displayed the mental development of a young child despite his chronological age. The political implications of Charles's condition created constitutional crisis throughout the Spanish Empire. His inability to govern effectively required regency arrangements that continued well beyond his legal majority, while his obvious incapacity to father children created succession problems that would eventually trigger major European warfare. Charles's 2 marriages represented desperate attempts to produce an heir from genetic material that was simply too concentrated to permit normal reproduction. His wives, Marie-Louise of Orléans and Maria Anna of Neuburg, were selected for their fertility records and genetic distance from Habsburg bloodlines, but neither could overcome the biological obstacles created by his condition. The complete absence of children from either marriage confirmed contemporary fears about the genetic consequences of excessive inbreeding, while also creating the succession crisis that would reshape European politics after Charles's death. The Spanish Habsburg line would end with him, bringing centuries of dynastic continuity to a close. Contemporary physicians attributed Charles's condition to everything from witchcraft to divine punishment, reflecting their inability to understand genetic mechanisms that would not be scientifically explained for centuries. His treatment included exorcisms, bloodletting, and various ineffective medical interventions that probably worsened rather than improved his condition. The autopsy performed after Charles's death revealed physical abnormalities so severe that contemporary doctors struggled to describe them adequately. His internal organs were described as barely functional, while his skeletal system showed evidence of developmental problems that had affected his entire body structure. Modern medical analysis of historical descriptions suggests that Charles may have suffered from multiple genetic disorders simultaneously, including not only the visible Habsburg jaw but also hormonal imbalances, immune system defects, and neurological problems that created his complex medical presentation. The political response to Charles's obvious incapacity varied from denial to desperate attempts at remediation that included consulting fortune tellers, religious mystics, and foreign physicians whose exotic treatments promised miraculous cures that never materialized. Court officials maintained the fiction of royal competence even when Charles was clearly incapable of meaningful decision-making. His personal interests, such as they were, included an obsession with death and decay that may have reflected awareness of his own physical deterioration. Charles reportedly enjoyed watching autopsies and kept human skulls in his private chambers, behavior that disturbed even his accustomed courtiers. The international implications of Charles's condition affected European diplomacy for decades before his death, as foreign powers positioned themselves to benefit from the inevitable Spanish succession crisis. His inability to produce heirs made the Spanish Empire available to whichever claimant could establish the strongest legal and military case for inheritance. Charles's death in 1700 triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that lasted 12 years and involved most major European powers. The genetic policies that had created his condition thus contributed directly to military conflicts that killed hundreds of thousands of people and reshaped the European balance of power. The cultural impact of Charles's story extended far beyond immediate political consequences to influence European attitudes toward royal genetics and marriage policies. His example provided clear evidence of the dangers associated with excessive inbreeding, contributing to gradual abandonment of the most extreme forms of dynastic intermarriage. The women who had contributed to Charles's genetic heritage through generations of cousin marriage were not responsible for his individual tragedy, yet their collective marriage decisions had created the biological conditions that made his condition inevitable. Their stories thus connect personal choice with systemic consequences across multiple generations. Modern geneticists consider Charles II one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding effects in recorded human history, making his case valuable for understanding the biological mechanisms that create genetic problems in closed populations. His condition provides scientific insights that extend far beyond royal family histories to encompass broader questions about human genetics and population health. As the final echoes of royal footsteps fade into silence, we witness the aftermath of genetic concentration and dynastic collapse. The death of Charles II marked not merely the end of Spanish Habsburg rule but the beginning of European recognition that bloodline purity had been purchased at an unsustainable biological cost. The War of the Spanish Succession that followed Charles's death brought Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, to the Spanish throne as Philip V. This Bourbon succession represented both political necessity and genetic opportunity, introducing French bloodlines into Spanish royal inheritance for the first time in generations. Elizabeth Farnese, Philip II's second wife, understood the genetic implications of Spanish royal history and actively sought to diversify Habsburg bloodlines through strategic marriage policies that balanced political advantage with biological necessity. Her children would inherit both Spanish political traditions and French genetic characteristics that would strengthen the royal bloodline. The Austrian Habsburgs, still ruling from Vienna, adapted their marriage policies to reflect awareness of genetic problems while maintaining their commitment to dynastic continuity. Maria Theresa's 16 children would be deployed throughout European courts in marriages designed to preserve Habsburg influence, while avoiding the most extreme forms of genetic concentration. The survival strategies adopted by post-Habsburg royal families included increased marriages with foreign nobility, broader acceptance of genetic diversity within royal bloodlines, and gradual abandonment of the strictest requirements for bloodline purity that had characterized earlier dynastic policies. Contemporary observers noted the improved health and political effectiveness of royal children whose parents came from more diverse genetic backgrounds. The contrast with late Habsburg decline was so striking that genetic diversity became associated with dynastic success rather than contamination of royal blood. The institutional legacies left by Habsburg women continued to influence European culture and politics long after the genetic problems that had constrained their dynasty had been resolved through outbreeding. Their administrative innovations, cultural patronage, and political precedents outlasted the biological limitations that had ultimately destroyed their family's political dominance. The scientific understanding of royal genetic problems contributed to broader European awareness of heredity and its political implications. The Habsburg example provided evidence for biological theories that would eventually contribute to modern genetic science, though the immediate political applications were more significant than the theoretical developments. The cultural memory of Habsburg decline influenced European attitudes toward marriage, heredity, and political legitimacy for generations after the dynasty's collapse. The visible evidence of genetic concentration created lasting skepticism about claims that bloodline purity was essential for political authority. The women whose stories we have traced through these dark corridors of European history were both creators and victims of systems that they could neither fully understand nor effectively resist. Their lives illustrate the complex relationships between individual agency and systemic constraints that characterized royal women's experiences throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Their legacy includes not only the genetic patterns that they transmitted to their descendants, but also the cultural achievements, political innovations, and personal courage that they demonstrated while fulfilling dynastic responsibilities under increasingly difficult biological circumstances. The institutional structures that they created or supported continued to influence European development long after the genetic problems that had constrained their own lives had been resolved through changes in marriage policies and scientific understanding of hereditary mechanisms. Their stories remind us that individual biography and systemic history intersect in complex ways that can only be understood through careful attention to both personal experience and broader patterns of social and political development. The women who carried Habsburg genetics forward through generations of increasing concentration were neither saints nor villains but human beings who responded to impossible circumstances with whatever courage and intelligence they could muster. The final lesson of their lives may be that individual resilience and capability can temporarily overcome systemic problems, but cannot prevent the long-term consequences of policies that prioritize abstract principles over human welfare. Their experiences demonstrate both the possibilities and the limitations that confront individuals who must live within systems that they did not create and cannot fundamentally alter. As dawn approaches and our journey through these haunted corridors nears its end, we can see that the story of royal inbreeding encompasses more than merely genetic curiosity or historical tragedy. These women's lives illuminate fundamental questions about power, heredity, and human adaptation that remain relevant to our understanding of how societies balance tradition with biological reality. Their legacy lives on not only in the genetic patterns that they transmitted, but in the cultural achievements that they supported, the political precedents that they established, and the human courage that they demonstrated, while bearing the impossible burden of dynastic expectation under increasingly difficult biological circumstances. In the end, their stories remind us that history is made by individual human beings who must navigate the constraints and opportunities created by the systems into which they are born, and that understanding these individual experiences is essential for comprehending the broader patterns of social and political development that shape our world. Let their whispered voices fade now into the silence of centuries, carrying with them the weight of crowns that were too heavy to bear and bloodlines that were too concentrated to survive, yet also the memory of courage, intelligence, and dignity maintained under circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. As you drift towards sleep, may you find peace in knowing that you carry no such burdens, bear no such genetic inheritance, and face no such impossible choices. Rest now in the quiet darkness, free from the weight of dynasties and the price of purity, in the gentle embrace of ordinary human heritage that asks nothing more than that you live, love, and find happiness in the simple gift of existence itself. The candles flicker out, the echoes fade, and sleep claims another listener to these ancient tales of power and its costs, of love and its limitations, of human beings who wore crowns that history would judge too heavy for any mortal head to bear.